Today we're going to be doing Chapter 2, The Fearing Invasion. Much Afraid woke early the next morning, and all her fears were gone. Her first thought was, probably sometime today I am to start for the high places with the shepherd. This so excited her that she could hardly eat her breakfast. And as she began making arrangements for her departure, she couldn't help but sing. It seemed to her that ever since the seed of love had been planted in her heart, songs of joy were welling up in her innermost being. And the songs which best expressed this new happiness and thankfulness were from the old book which the shepherds so loved to use as they worked among the flocks and led them to the pastures. As she carried out the simple arrangements the shepherd had told her to make, she sang another of these songs, and it went like this. Now when the king at table sits, my spikenard smelleth sweet, and myrrh and camphire from my store I pour upon his feet. My thankful love must be displayed, he loved and wooed a beggar maid. Ye daughters of Jerusalem, I'm black to look upon, as goatskin tents, but also as the tent of Solomon. Without I bear the marks of sin, but love's adorning is within. Despise me not that I am black, the sun has burned my face. My mother's children hated me and drove me from my place. In their vineyards I toiled and wept, but my own vineyard have not kept. I am not fair, save to the king, though fair my royal dress. His kingly grace is lavished on my need and worthlessness. My blemishes he will not see, but loves the beauty that shall be. From time to time, as she went about her work, her heart fluttered, half with excitement, half with dread of the unknown. But whenever she remembered the thorn in her heart, she tingled from head to foot with the same mysterious sweetness. Love was for her. Yes, even for her, crippled, little much afraid. When she reached the high places, she was to lose her humiliating disfigurements and be made beautiful. And when the plant in her heart was ready to bloom, she was to be loved in return. Even as she thought of this, doubt mingled with the sweetness. Surely it could not be possible. Just a beautiful dream, but not reality. Oh, I am afraid it won't ever happen, she would say to herself. And then when she thought of the shepherd, her heart quickened again, and she would run to the door or the window to see if he was coming to call her. The morning wore on, and still he had not come. But just after midday, something else came. An invasion of her terrible relatives. All of a sudden, before she realized what was happening, they were upon her. There was tramping of feet and clamor of voices, and then she was surrounded by a whole army of aunts and uncles and cousins. Craven, however, was not with them. The family, hearing of his reception the night before, and realizing that she shrank from him with peculiar dread and terror, had decided that it was best that he did not come. They were determined to overrule Much Afraid's objections to the marriage, and if possible, get her out of the cottage and into one of their own dwelling places. Their plan was to make a bold attack while she would be alone in the cottage and the shepherd far away with his flocks, so they hoped she would be at their mercy. She could not be forcibly abducted in broad daylight, because there was too many servants of the shepherd in the village, and they would instantly come to her assistance. However, they knew Much Afraid's timidity and weakness, and they believed that if there were enough of them present, they could cower her into consenting to go with them to the mansion of old Lord Fearing, and then they would have her in their power. In fact, the old lord himself was actually with them, assuring her in a fatherly tone that they had come with the kindest and friendliest intentions. He understood she had some objections to the proposed marriage, and he wanted to have the opportunity of quietly talking them over with her to see if he could set them at rest. It seemed to him that it was a suitable and attractive match in every way, and there must be some extraordinary misunderstanding in her mind which a little understanding talked together would set right. If not, he assured her kindly that he would not permit her to be married against her will. When he had finished, a babel of other fearing voices all broke in, reasoning with her and making all kinds of suggestions. The fact was, they told her, that she had cut herself off from her relatives for so long, it was now quite apparent she had all kinds of strange notions about them and their intentions toward her. It was really only right that she now spend a little time with them and give them the opportunity to prove that she had misjudged and misunderstood them. Craven might not just be as handsome and pleasing in appearance as a prince in a fairy tale, and it was true that he had some unfortunate, rather rough manner, but that was because he had known nothing of the softening and refining influences of marriage. Certainly, the responsibilities and joys of married life would quickly change this, and would indeed effect a transformation in him. And it was her delightful privilege to assist as principal mover in bringing about this reformation that they all so eagerly wished to see. The whole gang talked on and on, while poor Much Afraid sat cowering in their midst, almost too dazed to know what they were saying or suggesting. Just as they had hoped, they were gradually bringing her to a state of bewilderment and incoherent fear. It looked as though they would soon be able to persuade her that it was her duty to attempt the impossible task of trying to convert Craven Fear into something less objectionable than he really was. Suddenly, there came an interruption from without. The Fearings had carefully closed the door when they entered the cottage and even contrived to bolt it so that Much Afraid could not escape. But now came the distant sound of a man's voice in song, singing one of the songs from the old book, which Much Afraid knew and loved so well. Then the singer himself came in view, slowly passing along the lane. It was the chief shepherd, already leading his flock to the watering place. The words floated in through the open window, accompanied by the soft bleating of the sheep and the scuffling of many little dusty feet as they pattered after him. It seemed as though all other sounds were hushed to stillness on that quiet summer afternoon as the shepherds sang while passing the cottage. Inside, the clamor of voices had ceased instantly and was succeeded by a silence that could be felt. And this is what he sang. The voice of my beloved, through all my heart it thrills. He leaps upon the mountains and skips upon the hills. For like a roe or young hart, so swift and strong is he. He looks through my window and beckons to me. Rise up, my love, my fair one, and come away with me. Gone are the snows of winter, the rains no more we see. The flowers are appearing, the little birds all sing. The turtle dove is calling, through all the land 'tis spring. The shoots are on the grapevines, the figs are on the tree. Arise, my love, my fair one, and come away with me. Why is my dove still hiding, when all things else rejoice? Oh, let me see thee, fair one. Oh, let me hear thy voice. As she sat listening in the cottage, Much Afraid knew with a pang of agonizing pain that the shepherd was calling her to go with him to the mountains. This was the secret signal he promised, and he had said that she had to be ready to leave instantly the moment she heard it. Now here she was, locked inside her own cottage, beleaguered by her own terrible fears, and unable to respond in any way to his call or even give any sign of her need. There was one moment indeed when the song first started and everyone was startled into silence. That was perfect for her to have called him to come and help her. She did not realize that the Fearings were holding their breath lest she did call, and had she done so, they would have fled helter-skelter through that door. However, she was too stunned with fear to seize the opportunity, and then it was too late. The next thing she knew, she felt Coward's heavy hand tightly over her mouth. Then other hands gripped her firmly and held her in the chair. So the shepherd slowly passed the cottage, showing himself at the window, singing the signal song, and receiving no response of any kind. When he had passed and the words of the song and the bleating of the sheep had died away in the distance, it was found that Much Afraid had fainted. Her cousin Coward's gagging hands had half choked her. Her relatives would dearly have liked to take this opportunity to carry her off now while she was unconscious, but as this was the hour when everybody was returning from the fields from work, it was too dangerous. The Fearings decided, therefore, that they would remain silent in the cottage until darkness fell, then gag Much Afraid and carry her off unperceived. When this plan had been decided on, they laid her on the bed to recover as best as she could, while some of the aunts and cousins went out to the kitchen to see what provisions for refreshing themselves might be plundered. The men sat smoking in the sitting room, and Gloomy was left to guard the half-conscious victim in her bedroom. Gradually, Much Afraid regained her senses, and she realized her position, and she almost nearly fainted again in horror. She dared not cry out for help, for all her neighbors would be away at their work. But were they? No. It was later than she thought, for suddenly she heard the voice of Mrs. Valiant, her neighbor in the cottage next door. At the sound, Much Afraid braced herself for one last desperate bid for escape. Gloomy was quite unprepared for such a move as this, and before she realized what was happening, Much Afraid sprang from the bed and shouted through the window as loudly as her fear permitted, "Valiant! Valiant! Come and help me! Come quickly! Help!" At the sound of her first cry, Mrs. Valiant looked across the garden and caught a glimpse of Much Afraid's white, terrified face in the window and of her hand beckoning her entreatingly. The next moment, the face was jerked away from view and a curtain was suddenly pulled over the window. That was enough for Mrs. Valiant, whose name describes her exactly. She hurried straight across to her neighbor's cottage and tried the door, but finding it locked, she looked in through a window and saw the room full of Much Afraid's relatives. Mrs. Valiant was not the sort of person to be the least intimidated by what she called a pack of idle fears. Thrusting her face right through that open window, she cried out in a threatening voice, "Out of this house you go, this minute, every one of you. If you have not left in 3 seconds, I shall call the chief shepherd. This cottage belongs to him, and won't you catch it if he finds you here?" The effects of her words were magical. The door was unbolted, thrown open, and the Fearings poured out pell-mell, tumbling over one another in their haste to get away. Mrs. Valiant smiled grimly as she watched their flight. When the last one had scuttled away, she went into the cottage to Much Afraid, who seemed quite overcome with fear and distress. Little by little, she learned the story and the plan to kidnap the poor victim after darkness fell. Mrs. Valiant hardly knew herself what it was to feel fear, and had just routed the whole gang of them by herself. She felt much inclined to adopt a bracing attitude and chide the silly girl for not standing up to her relatives at once, boldly repulsing them before they got her into their clutches. But as she looked at the white face and terrified eyes and saw the quaking body of poor Much Afraid, she checked herself. What is the use of saying it? She can't act upon it, poor thing. She's one of them herself. She's got fearing in her blood. And when the enemy is within you, it's a poor prospect indeed. I think no one but the shepherd himself can really help her, she said to herself. So instead of an admonition, she patted the trembling girl and said with all the kindness of her motherly heart, "Now, my dear, while you're getting over your fright, I'll just pop into the kitchen and make a good cup of tea for both of us, and you'll feel better at once. My, if they haven't put a kettle on for us," she added as she opened the kitchen door and found the cloth already on the table and the preparations for the plundered meal which the unwanted visitors had so hastily abandoned. "What a pack of harpies!" she muttered angrily to herself, and then smiled complacently as she remembered how fast they had fled before her. By the time they had drunk their tea, and Mrs. Valiant had energetically cleared away the last traces of the unwelcome invaders, Much Afraid had nearly recovered her composure. Darkness had long since fallen, and now it was much too late for her to go to the pool to keep tryst with the shepherd, and explain why she hadn't responded to his call. She would have to wait until morning light. So at Mrs. Valiant's suggestion, she was feeling utterly exhausted, and she went straight to bed. Her neighbor saw her safely tucked in and kissed her warmly and reassuringly. In fact, she had offered to sleep in the cottage herself that night, but Much Afraid, knowing that Valiant had a family waiting for her at home, refused the kind offer. However, before leaving, Mrs. Valiant placed a bell beside her bed and assured her that if anything alarmed her in the night, she had only ring the bell and the whole entire Valiant family would be there instantly to help her. And then she went away, and Much Afraid was left alone in the cottage. And that's chapter 2. Thanks.